This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm Rebecca Larson, and well, if you're here, you can tell that this is definitely not Dr. Emma with me today.
I'm doing my best impression. Come on, give me a break. I'll lose the beard if it'll help.
Yeah, can you do a Spanish accent on top of it?
Might be pushing it a little bit too far.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, Dr. Emma just needed to take a little bit of a break, so Matt Lewis was nice enough to step in for this week at least. To fill in and talk to me about some conspiracy theories. And the one that we're going to talk about today is rather juicy. When he told me about it, I was so excited. And I was like, we have to talk about this. So first of all, why don't we start? I'll have you explain what the theory is, and then let's kind of like do the backstory and the lead up to it.
Yeah, so this is kind of two theories in one. This is me talking about the Tudor world, because this is definitely Tudor. And this revolves around Jane Guildford, who becomes Jane Dudley. People may well know her better as Jane Dudley, the wife of John Dudley, who becomes Duke of Northumberland and is often considered the mastermind behind Lady Jane Grey's accession. And it is a theory. People who might have heard me speak before will not be surprised that this is a balmy conspiracy theory that links Jane Guildford to the princes in the Tower. Yes, I'm going to go there.
Love this. And let's also add, because maybe some people even don't know who John Dudley was, she was also the mother of Robert Dudley, Elizabeth I's favorite.
Yeah, so her children are incredibly significant. Their fourth son, Guildford Dudley, marries Lady Jane Grey, which is part of the story that we're going to get into. And Robert Dudley will obviously become a really significant figure in the second half of the 16th century, and his relationship with Elizabeth I. And if you believe this theory that I'm going to spout to you today and desperately try to convince you they might have legs, it shines a whole new light on the relationship between Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I.
Oh, I can't. Okay, so how does Jane Guildford relate to the princes in the Tower?
Well, this all revolves around a theory that was put together and espoused by a man named Jack Leslaw. So this is his work that I'm leaning on. He has a website that you can go to check out all of his work. His family, he passed away, unfortunately, in the late 90s. But his family were kind enough to let me include his work in my Survival of the Princes in the Tower books. That's the plug done. I'll get over that now. Because it's just something. So there is kind of two halves to the Jack Leslaw theory, and he's an amateur art historian who believed that he had found some clues about the continued existence of the princes in the Tower in Tudor England, hidden in plain sight in portraiture. And half of the theory revolves around the potential survival of the younger of the princes in the Tower, Richard, Duke of York, as a figure named John Clement, who is connected to Thomas More. So he grows up in Thomas More's household. John Clement is a real figure. Grows up in Thomas More's household. He's the puer maius to whom Thomas More dedicates his book Utopia. But we know very, very little about John Clement's origins. We don't know when he's born. We don't know where he comes from. We don't know how he appears in Thomas More's household. But he will end up marrying one of Thomas More's adopted daughters too, so marries into the family. John Clement, so Jack Leslaw believed John Clement was Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower. I have a slight modifier on this theory that suggests he could have been actually a child, one of the children of Perkin Warbeck. So some sources talk about Perkin Warbeck when he lands in England, that Catherine Gordon came with her child and was pregnant with another child at the time that they landed. And I think you can make slightly more sense of the timeline if perhaps this John Clement, you might think of him as being a son of Perkin Warbeck rather than Richard, Duke of York himself. So, but I think Perkin Warbeck was Richard, Duke of York. So are you following me so far?
I'm intrigued.
Right. So John Clement, absolutely fascinating figure. In 1510, just after Henry VIII's coronation, John Clement appears in the lists of a joust, fighting against Henry VIII. And the other people involved in this joust are close family members of Henry VIII. They're his uncles, or they're his very close friends, people like Charles Brandon, We also see Arthur Plantagenet, the illegitimate son of Edward IV, taking part in this joust. So this is Henry's inner circle. And how does John Clement fit into that? How is he getting into the lists against the king? Because we have no idea who he is. But we do know that Henry at this point is surrounding himself by Yorkist relatives. Arthur Plantagenet is his uncle. His illegitimate uncle on the Yorkist side is an illegitimate son of Edward IV. And the story continues. So there are records of John Clement being enrolled in Louvain University, where he goes to learn medicine. He's excused from swearing the oath of allegiance to the university in Louvain. And Jack Leslaw suggested that this is because he was living under an assumed identity and that swearing this oath of allegiance would effectively be perjury. So that the university records that he is excused from swearing the usual oath for reasons that are known and have been accepted. So something's gone on. Something interesting is going on with John Clement. He becomes the president of the Royal College of Physicians in England. For a time, he is in the direct service of Henry VIII. He is a physician to Henry VIII. Again, we don't know how he has got this proximity to royalty, where that's come from. The records at Louvain University refer to him as a nobleman from England, but there is no noble Clement family in England. There never has been. We can start getting into little bits of the army conspiracy theories now.
I feel like I'm so curious.
Hear eyes rolling all over the place. So when we think about where might the name Clement come from, Perkin Warbeck is executed on St. Clement's Day. Well, I don't know. Is that just a coincidence? I don't know. It might be. Is it just a coincidence?
Wow.
And then John Clement. So the story with John Clement doesn't end there. He's really closely associated with Thomas More. So when Thomas More is arrested for refusing to swear the oath of supremacy for Henry VIII, John Clement is arrested too, and he's thrown into Fleet Prison. He's not executed, and this is where we start to bring in John Dudley. He's not executed in part because John Dudley, randomly, who we know of no connection between John Clement and John Dudley. John Clement is an ardent Catholic. John Dudley is by this point a reformist, and is attaching himself to the Reformation movement. John Dudley writes to Thomas Cromwell and says, can you make sure John Clement is well looked after? Some people are going to come to you and tell you that he needs to be executed or harshly dealt with, but I need you to protect him and look after him. I mean, what is going on there? What is that? Why are you asking that?
Yeah.
And Thomas Cromwell does it. John Clement is taken care of. When More is executed, he is released from prison and goes over to the continent and stays in Louvain again, goes back to where he went to university and becomes connected to the university there for a while. While Edward VI is king, he stays out of England, and when Mary comes to the throne and England is restored to Catholicism, he and his family come back to England again. They move back into their house at Marshfoot, and when Elizabeth comes to the throne instead, John Clement and his family again leave England and go back to the Low Countries, and we have an inventory from their house when they leave that includes kind of banners of the 5 wounds of Christ, which is the standard of the pilgrimage of grace and things like that. So he's clearly a recalcitrant Catholic who doesn't want to be in Elizabeth I's Protestant England. Goes off back to the Low Countries, and we have no record of what happens to his wife. We have no record of what happens to his children. We know he has children, but we don't know where they go or what happens to them. We know that when he dies, he is buried at the high altar in the cathedral at Mechlin, which is where members of the Burgundian royal family or the Burgundian ducal family are buried.
This just gave me goosebumps.
What is going on with this man? So, and we should point out, Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, the Yorkist family member and the champion of efforts against Henry VII, is based for the last years of her life at Mechlin. That's where she has her court.
Yeah.
How is he getting buried at the high altar at Mechlin Cathedral amongst the ducal family of Burgundy. What right does he have to be there? How is he being described as a nobleman all over the place when there is no noble Clement family? How is he getting into the lists of a joust in 1510 against King Henry VIII amongst his close relatives and best friends? This theory is that John Clement is connected to the princes in the Tower, that he's either the youngest of them, or I suggest maybe a child of the youngest of the princes in the Tower. But whether you believe that or not, John Clement is an absolutely fascinating figure. I would love to know more about him, and just how he gets to the position that he's in. Conspiracy theory, barminess number 2. John Clement is the only president of the College of Physicians for whom we don't have a surviving signature. In the entire history of the Royal College of Physicians, we've got a copy of the signature of every president except John Clement.
Why? Why do you think that is?
Is he not signing legal documents because it's an assumed identity?
Right.
I don't know.
You know what? So far, this whole thing, the only thing that doesn't quite fit for me is that he was put in the Fleet prison instead of the Tower, because the Fleet was more for the common man and the Tower would have been more for nobles. But if they were trying to hide him, maybe that's why they would put him in the Fleet.
And maybe they're worried about, if you put him in the Tower, does that draw more attention? Because why is John Clement being thrown in the Tower? What is there about John Clement that earns him a place in the Tower? Then people start asking questions.
Yeah.
But I don't know. And Leslaw's theory, so to round off the John Clement thing, Leslaw's theory is that if you look at the Hans Holbein portrait of Thomas More's family, which is done in the late 1520s, just after the death of Thomas More's father. So Thomas More's father is in it. His second wife is in it. All of his daughters are there. His son is there. His fool, Henry Pattinson, is there. And look at this portrait. People, if you're watching this or listening to this, Google this portrait, look at Henry Pattinson in that photo, and tell me that is not Holbein painting Henry VIII. I dare you to tell me that's not Henry VIII. It looks exactly like Holbein's famous portrait of Henry VIII standing with his hands on his hips. He's got a beret on with the badges of St. George and the Tudor rose and stuff like this on it. It screams Henry VIII at me. And the other figure that is in the portrait is a figure in the background. So he's next to Henry Pattinson in the background towards the right of the picture. He's bizarrely walking out of a solid wall. He's halfway through walking out of a solid wall, which it seems like an odd mistake for Holbein to make, because he doesn't make mistakes. He's quite good as an artist.
Yeah.
The name above his head says Johannes Heresius, which has normally been translated as John Harris. And you can find someone in Thomas More's household, one of his secretaries, called John Harris. But what is one of his secretaries doing in a family portrait with all of his daughters and his son and his dad and his wife?
Yeah.
So Leslaw suggested that this figure wasn't John Harris, this is John Clement. And he's in the portrait because he's part of Thomas More's family, close family.
Yeah.
And so every other name in the portrait, everybody has their name above them. Capital letter on the first name, capital letter on the surname. John Harris is the only one who doesn't. So Johannes is capitalised, John is capitalised. Heresius has a lowercase h to begin it with. If you translate Heres Eius from Latin into English, it translates as rightful heir.
Holy shit. Excuse my language.
Heres is heir, Eius is rightful, legal, justified. So does this say John the rightful heir? And Jack Leslaw points to so much stuff in this portrait. It's really hard if you're not looking at a picture of it. But it's all in the book, and it's all on Jack Leslaw's website that his family maintain too. Down to the passages from Oedipus that are being read by Thomas More's wife. Jack Leslaw has a theory for everything that is going on in this portrait, and he uses homophones of courtly French language. So there are things in the portrait that he will point to, and he will say, if you say this word in courtly French, it sounds like two very different things sometimes. And he's also, he's pointed to other works by Holbein that back this up as well, where he's using those same tricks in a demonstrable way that have been proven. So, for example, there is one of Thomas More's daughters, Elizabeth, who is in the painting. She's in the process of putting a glove on, but she doesn't have the other glove anywhere near her. So Jacques Leslaw's suggestion is here that the French le pair lui manque means the pair is missing. There isn't a full pair. But also, le père lui manque means the father is missing. So pair and pair, spell it differently, but you say it the same.
Okay.
The father is missing. And he points to so much stuff in this portrait. I've been obsessed by this theory for decades now. Probably explains an awful lot about me, and I apologise for all of that. But I want to know more about John Clement. We know this guy's buried at the high altar in Mechlin Cathedral. Theoretically, you could DNA test him and find out whether he is related at all to the princes in the tower. But whether he is or not, he's one of those figures who I think I would love to know more about. I would love to go on a quest to find out where John Clement came from and why he's being treated in this incredible way. What is the connection that gets him into More's household? What is the connection that makes John Dudley, of all people, write to Thomas Cromwell and say, make sure this guy's taken care of, in spite of the fact that people are going to tell you to do something horrible to him. Don't listen to them. Take care of them. What is going on there? So this is half of the theory that Jacques Leslaw had, because the other half revolved around the continued existence of the elder of the princes in the tower, Edward V.
Yeah,
I'm
loving this.
Guildford.
I am loving this.
Jane Guildford. I promise she's coming in. So Jacques Leslaw believed that he had found kind of clues, indicators. I don't think he would ever have said he believed he'd proven that this is true, but this was his theory, that Edward V continues to live in Tudor England using the name and under the persona of a fairly well-known Tudor courtier named Sir Edward Guildford. Edward Guildford is a close associate of Henry VIII. Does Henry VIII have friends? I don't know. Does anyone want to be friends with Henry VIII? Not me. But he becomes a standard bearer for Henry VIII, so he's really closely connected to him. He is recorded as the oldest son of a man named Sir Richard Guildford. He has a half-brother from Sir Richard's second marriage named Henry Guildford, and they both enjoy really successful careers at Henry VIII's court. They're really close to him. Edward Guildford becomes Master of the Armoury, Constable of Dover Castle, Warden of the Cinque Ports, the Marshal of Calais. He is behind organising a lot of what goes on at the Field of Cloth of Gold in when is that, 1525?
Yeah, that sounds right. 1525.
I'm not a Tudor historian.
I could be wrong too.
But anyway, at the Field of Cloth of Gold, I should have avoided saying when that was.
I think you were right.
He is responsible for a lot of the arrangements that go on there too. So a really central figure at Henry VIII's court. We have records of money being given to him for the costs of putting on tournaments and jousts and building scaffolds and everything else for those. In 1515, we see him crop up in a letter from Thomas Wolsey saying that Edward Guildford was in France, but when he returns to England, he'll report on various matters that he's heard. So he's clearly doing some important diplomatic work for Henry VIII. And to a large extent, I think this speaks against the idea that this is one of his uncles. He's probably not going to send him overseas and get him engaged in diplomatic activity. Maybe not the smartest move. Right. With someone who might decide to announce while they're overseas that they're actually the rightful king of England.
Yeah.
So we get an episode in 1525 when Edward Guildford brings charges against Lord Bergavenny for illegally retaining men in Kent. So he's trying to create this kind of private army, and this was almost immediately after the attainder of Bergavenny's father-in-law, who is Edward Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, who Henry VIII has executed.
Gotcha.
Dukes of Buckingham unlikely to be friends of the princes in the Tower.
Yes,
Is that an interesting connection? But the interesting thing, that the point that Leslor makes about that case is that the contrast between the two men, because Lord Bergavenny is kind of old money. You know, he's old nobility. He has a landed power base and plenty of money from that and an established line. Whereas Edward Guildford is very much representative of the new money. He has no power base. He has offices and incomes directly from the king, which means that his livelihood is utterly reliant on Henry VIII. He's definitely not alone in that. But if you're looking for a way to control someone who, you know, might decide to do something threatening, the fact that Henry could take everything away from him with the stroke of a pen might be a way to manage that situation. And that case kind of highlights those two differences between them. And so then we get this connection emerge between John Dudley and Edward Guildford. So John Dudley's dad, Edmund Dudley, along with Richard Empson, become the kind of hated, despised face of Henry VII's later financial policies. You know, they're the ones screwing money out of everybody left, right and centre, making enemies all over the place, which with the benefit of hindsight is a stupid idea when the king is old and he's not going to last very long.
Right.
They clearly felt that maybe Henry VIII would think, this is great, you carry on. Henry VIII doesn't. And I think for me, in a fairly cynical effort to court a bit of favour and to make himself popular, Henry VIII immediately has them arrested and executed in 1510. So this leaves Edmund's son, John, as the son of an attainted traitor. Edmund had got, again, he's got no noble titles or anything like that, but he has got incredibly wealthy. But he's attainted in Parliament as a traitor, loses all of those lands and everything else. His mother then remarries, so she marries Arthur Plantagenet, the illegitimate uncle of Henry VIII, the illegitimate son of Edward IV.
Good marriage.
So the family are moving pretty close into royal circles here. And it is eventually, so Arthur Plantagenet becomes Viscount Lisle, is a title that he acquires from his wife. It's a title that belonged to John Dudley's mother. That's how he acquires it. But John Dudley isn't kept in the household of his mother. He is put in the custody of Sir Edward Guildford. He's about 6 years old when his father is executed. He's placed in the household and he is brought up there in 1512, so a couple of years into his tenure in the household of Edward Guildford. Edward Guildford puts in a petition in Parliament to have John's father's attainder overturned, and this is granted. So he's no longer a traitor, and John is able to lay claim to some of the property and some of the money that his father had. In 1526, Edward Guildford goes back and asks for the marriage rights of John Dudley as well. And when that's granted, he marries John Dudley to his daughter, Jane Guildford. So Jane and John have grown up together in Edward Guildford's household. And here we've got someone, so for Edward Guildford, who is a man on the rise, he's got significant offices around the king. He is doing very, very well for himself. Why has he chosen to marry his daughter, his only daughter, to this random boy, son of a traitor who had no lands, no titles, nothing meaningful?
Yeah, good question.
What's the interest in John Dudley? Well, I mean, so John Dudley, the idea that he comes from nowhere sort of belies the truth. I've mentioned that he's an heir to the title of Viscount Lisle. So when Arthur Plantagenet dies, he is in line to acquire that title from his mother. We know that will take a significant amount of time to come because Arthur Plantagenet lives for a very long time to a ripe old age. But his mom is also she is a great-granddaughter of John Talbot, the first Earl of Shrewsbury, so old Talbot, who became famous in the wars in France, one of the only Englishmen known to Joan of Arc, that kind of figure. And her great-great-grandfather is Richard Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick. So, again, another really significant figure in the early 15th century, famous for his wars in France, again, chivalric figure. So, actually, John Dudley doesn't have no pedigree, but all of the pedigree that he has comes from his mother. And he's not actually heir to anything other than the Viscount Lisle title. So he's from a junior branch of the family. So the Dudley lands and titles actually belong to the Sutton family. They owned Dudley Castle around this time. And the Sutton family begin to use the surname Dudley a little bit. So junior branches of the family become the Dudleys. So John is from a junior branch of this family, not really going to inherit anything other than the title Viscount Lisle from his mom when his stepfather eventually passes away. So it's an interesting, odd match, I think. Edward Guildford is recorded as dying in 1534. There is a detailed letter that's sent to the Duke of Norfolk, and it gets reported to Thomas Cromwell as well by somebody else. But it's all really confused about what actually happens when he dies. There are other accounts that talk about him still being alive 2 years later. So nobody's really quite sure when Edward Guildford dies. This letter that's written on his death back to Cromwell says that his body won't be buried until the king's pleasure is understood. Why is the body not being buried until Henry VIII has said what he wants done with the body?
Yeah, I think
odd.
It is odd.
It seems weird. And then there's lots of talk about, his burial's postponed, and then he's eventually buried in the ground. Once they get the king's instructions, he's buried in the ground with no funeral service, with no tapers being lit, no bell ringing, in a poor grave, which seems like a really weird way for Henry to decide to deal with someone who had been a close friend and an interesting servant. But again, do you not want to draw attention to this man? Because Henry and those close to him know who this person really is. This is what Jack Leslor is suggesting. The other interesting thing about when Edward Guildford dies is that he doesn't leave a will. And so we're back in the realms here of, can you not create legal documents because you're living under an assumed identity? And that's partly interesting because the letter that goes to Cromwell is from someone who arrives at Leeds Castle and finds Edward Guildford ill, and he says, he was clearly very poorly and I advised him to make a will. And he dies several days after this and hasn't made a will. So it's not like it was unexpected that he was going to die. It's not like he hadn't had advice that he ought to make a will to deal with his affairs. So Edward Guildford had a son, but he's predeceased him. So his only remaining child is Jane. But what he does also have is a nephew from his half-brother, Henry. So in the absence of a will, you would expect everything that he belonged to go to his nearest male relative in Tudor England. So the nephew thinks, lovely, I'm going to get loads and loads of Uncle Edward's money. And despite the fact that there is no will, everything that he has passes to Jane. And there is no explanation for why that happens. Has he made a verbal will and been given some assurances that what he wants to happen? If Jack Leslor is correct and this is an identity that being used by Edward V, has he been promised that, you keep your head down and keep quiet, and whatever you've got, we'll make sure it stays in your bloodline? Because his nephew from his half-brother is not his bloodline, really, especially if their dad is not really his dad.
Yeah.
So this is all getting really... I can hear people rolling their eyes. I can hear you rolling your eyes. Stick with me. Stick with me.
I'm here. That's all that matters right now.
And so then, things move on. We've got these kind of bizarre occurrences and odd coincidences going on. And this is where we start to get to this connection between John Dudley as he rises to power and John Clement. And, why is he trying to get this recalcitrant Catholic protected in prison and make sure that nothing happens to him? Once he begins to rise, it's interesting, I think, when you look at the career of John Dudley, I think it's quite interesting what he's trying to do, because he becomes Viscount Lisle when Arthur Plantagenet dies, I think 1542. I should stop giving 16th century dates because I don't know them well enough.
That sounds about right, though.
I think it is. And when Henry VIII dies, he's one of the executors of Henry's will. He's on the council that's going to rule under Protector Somerset. And he is given the title Earl of Warwick. So he is making a bid for some of those family titles that he can trace back. There's no Earl of Warwick now since Edward Earl of Warwick was executed in 1499. The title is vacant, and he's got this kind of tenuous link through his mom and several generations back to the Earldom of Warwick, and he's suddenly starting to pull on those. We get a really interesting incident, which is, it's not really connected to this, but it's such a fascinating story. In 1540, when he's got Dudley Castle, he gets hold of Dudley Castle from one of his cousins, He essentially lends his cousin some money, which he knows he can't pay back, and gets the castle off him in 1537 when he defaults on the loan. So slightly ruthless figure.
Yeah.
1540, he begins building what's known as the Sharrington Range. So he gets this architect, William Sharrington, to come in and build it. And if you go to Dudley Castle today, you can still see the Sharrington Range there. It's fenced off at the moment because it's unsafe. They told me they need £9.5 million to make it safe again. So,
whoa, that's a lot.
It's in a bit of a parlour state at the moment. But while he's having this built in 1540, this knight comes to visit, who is Sir Andrew Flammock, who is a standard bearer of Henry VIII, famous knight, apparently famous for making fart jokes all the time. He was quite big on the fart jokes, particularly around the king. If the king blew his hunting trumpet, Andrew Flammock would do his best to fart at the same time.
Agree.
Apparently Henry VIII thought it was hilarious.
I do too.
Yeah, hale and hearty old knight turns up at Dudley Castle with his son on their travels through the counties and says, I need some hospitality for the night. And John Dudley's like, well, what, in my castle? Of course you can come and stay in my castle. But almost as soon as they get in there, it becomes really clear that Andrew Flammock and his son have got the plague. The son passes away from the plague quite quickly, and the physicians are reportedly telling John Dudley, Andrew Flammock is not going to last very long here. And John Dudley fires off this letter to Thomas Cromwell. This letter does not say we need to take precautions because there's an outbreak of the plague in Dudley in Staffordshire. It does not say, can you let the king know one of his best mates, Andrew Flammock, is really ill and not likely to survive, and terrible news, his son's already died. What this letter to Thomas Cromwell says is, Andrew Flammock's going to die and he's the keeper of Kenilworth Castle. When he's dead, can I have his job?
That's so John Dudley.
I mean, wow, John. So plenty of insight there into the kind of man that we're talking about with John Dudley. I think pretty ruthless.
Yeah.
But who wasn't at this time? He's hardly unusual in some of this, I think. But the interesting part of that is that when he starts to gather all these titles, becomes Earl of Warwick. Kenilworth Castle is another place that he gets hold of at that time. So he gets Warwick Castle and he gets Kenilworth Castle. So I think it's clear to me that John Dudley had this plan. This is not random titles and properties that he's having. He'd had his eye on Kenilworth Castle for years by the time he gets it. And I wonder whether he's trying to... You think about his father's fall, and his dad, because he has no power base of his own, he falls, and it really affects John as a child. And John has, more than a dozen children by this point too. And I wonder whether he's thinking about them. Because he's playing that kind of Icarus game in Tudor England, isn't he, of getting so close to the sun. He's playing with fire, and he knows he is, I think. And he knows that his father fell and it destroyed John's life. And, if Edward Guildford hadn't got that attainder undone, it would have completely destroyed John's life. And I wonder whether you can see him playing this game, knowing that he's probably going to get burned. He's probably going to fall. But if he can get all of these old titles that he can say belong in his family, the Earldom of Warwick, the Viscountcy of Lisle, the Barony of Dudley, he's got something to leave to his kids. He can get rich and he can rise high, and yes, he probably will fall because everybody does. Very few people don't. But can he kind of build this scaffolding around his family to protect them? And so then, obviously, as things move on, Edward VI becomes ill, and John Dudley really rises to the fore at this point. He gets the dukedom of Northumberland created for him. It's never been a dukedom before. All of a sudden, it's his, and he's a duke.
Yeah.
And we have this situation in which, as Edward VI is ailing, he's writing his will about the succession, and he's aiming it very much at the Grey family. Initially talking about, sons of the Grey sisters will survive. When it becomes clear that he's not going to survive long enough for them to have sons, it's rewritten so that particularly Jane Grey will succeed. And just before Edward VI dies, John Dudley marries his son Guildford. Interesting, he's kept the Guildford name, so he's got that from Edward Guildford. He's kept the Guildford name. So Guildford Dudley is married to Jane Grey. And we get these interesting moments at this point. So we get an insight into what's going on partly, because Jane Dudley reportedly has this conversation in which she tells Guildford to stop sleeping with Jane Grey until she agrees to make him king. Because Jane Grey wants to make him a duke. There's talk about whether he would be a king consort, whether that's even really a thing if you have a queen regnant, what do you call her husband? Jane Grey's like, I'll make him a duke. But she reports that Jane Dudley goes absolutely mad at this idea and is utterly insistent that her son has to be king. Not king consort, not a duke, he's got to be king. And Jack Leslaw's suggestion here is this is because Jane Guildford knows that her son, Guildford Dudley, is the grandson of Edward V. He's a rightful Yorkist heir.
Right.
And again, is that why there is some resistance to all of this amongst the establishment? This must have been a kind of open secret at the Tudor court. Other people must have known who Edward Guildford really was and what was going on around him, particularly people like Cromwell and all of those kinds of people. So it can't be that this was such a secret that nobody knows what's going on. So is the effort to keep Guildford away from the throne behind keeping Jane Grey away from the throne too? Because what they don't want is a Yorkist restoration that effectively ends the Tudor dynasty.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Jane is so insistent that her son has to be a king, and she's the one who won't accept anything less. It's not John Dudley that they're saying is adamant his son has to be a king. It's Jane. And perhaps one of the to round off these weird connections and coincidences, when Jane Guildford dies, she's buried in the Moore Chapel at Chelsea Church. So Thomas More's chapel in Chelsea Church. What is the connection between Jane Guildford and Thomas More? Unless John Clement was one of the princes in the tower and Thomas More is protecting the family's secret.
Yes.
Why is she buried there? And there is a photo that exists, you can probably find it on the internet, of Jack Leslaw standing at the tomb of Jane Guildford in the Moore Chapel at Chelsea Church. And the inscription on there describes Jane Guildford as the Princess Jane Guildford. How does the daughter of a Shire knight who's done quite well for himself in royal service get to describe herself as a princess in Tudor England? I mean, that is inflammatory, surely. Even the wife of a duke, John Dudley is not a royal duke. How is she positioning herself as a princess? How has she got agreement to carve Princess Jane Dudley on her tomb and have that installed in Thomas More's chapel at the Chelsea Church?
This is where your head explodes here, right?
It is. I mean, yes, this may all just be a real string of coincidences, but Jack Leslaw pieces these things together so convincingly for me that you find yourself thinking, obviously, they're the princes in the tower.
Obviously.
And I guess the final end game of this theory, the pinnacle that you can take it to, is that if Jane Dudley is connected to the princes in the tower, and Guildford Dudley was therefore a Yorkist heir, what about Guildford's brother, Robert Dudley?
Right.
Because he's going to become a pretty significant figure in Elizabethan England. What if this whole story of him being the love of Elizabeth's life and her being the love of his life, but for some reason they can't get married? What if that reason was the fact that she knows he's a Yorkist heir, that he's potentially going to position himself as the rightful king of England to displace her, and however much she might wish that she could marry him, she simply can't allow that disruption in her kingdom? Is the whole Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I thing essentially Romeo and Juliet?
Yeah.
The representatives of two rival houses, forced apart by faction, and however much they love each other, they are doomed not to be together.
Oh my!
I don't know, but it sounds pretty cool.
This is such a great story, and I have to backtrack a little bit because I was so excited when you wanted to talk about this because this kind of overlaps with my research as well. And I have always believed that John Dudley was completely responsible for the downfall and the executions of both Thomas Seymour and Edward Seymour. I fully believe
Which
that.
presumably makes him a really bad guy in your book.
Yeah, I've always believed he was a bad guy. Like the when you were talking about him being a bad guy, but most were, I was like, no, no, no. He was like, if there's a scale, he was toward the top of the worst, in my opinion.
Yeah, but also, are we just thinking bad of him for being good at what everybody else is doing? He's playing the same game as everybody else. He's just doing it better than everybody else. But I'm not going to try and defend someone who brings about the downfall of the Seymours because you'll never talk to me again.
But the other part of this is not only did he take down Thomas Seymour and he took down Edward Seymour, and this is my conspiracy theory, I've always believed that he was behind maybe poisoning Edward VI to, in turn, put his son on the throne. I mean, it all kind of fits.
It does. I mean, when you tie together the timeline of him causing Jane Grey and Guildford Dudley to get married, it's just before Edward is passing away, and it's when he's redrafting the will. And there has always been this suggestion that John Dudley is whispering in his ear to change this from the sons of a Grey daughter to one of the Greys. I mean, Jane Grey's mother is still alive, so if Jane Grey has a rightful claim to the throne, how does her mother not?
Right?
Is it John Dudley whispering in ears, saying, "Just make it Jane Grey. I know she's my daughter-in-law, but don't worry about that. Just make it Jane Grey. She's a great Protestant. She'll be an absolutely brilliant queen. You do that." So you can definitely imagine him. This is the guy who wanted to be keeper of Kenilworth Castle while the poor man who's currently got the job is dying in one of his bedrooms over there. You can absolutely see him making that play for absolute dynastic victory, to have a son on the throne of England for John Dudley. Can you imagine him thinking that as a 6-year-old boy when his dad is executed and he's got absolutely nothing, and all of a sudden he is Baron Dudley, Viscount Lisle, Earl of Warwick, Duke of Northumberland, and his son is going to be king? I mean, that is absolutely startling that he has managed to make that happen for his family. I guess the question is how much of that is built on being married to a relative of the princes in the Tower.
Exactly. Yeah. If you have your wife behind you pushing for this too, you're definitely going to do whatever you can to make it happen. I also find it interesting, and I don't know if this is just speculation, probably on my part, but during Thomas Seymour's downfall, I have records of every single testimony, confession during, when he was locked up in the Tower that I can find. It says, I think it was in the Acts of the Privy Council, that John Dudley gave a statement, but I can't find the statement anywhere. And it always makes me wonder if maybe it was destroyed at one point because he didn't want to be attached to the story anymore.
Yeah. What did that say that had to be, stricken from the record and destroyed? And as you say, how much of his rise could you put down if you believed Leslaw's theory was true and Jane Dudley is someone more significant? How much is he leveraging the fact that that's a secret that can't be exposed? He must have known who his wife was, if that's who she was. That must be why he's intervening in John Clement's case, because there is this connection between them that doesn't make sense any other way. How much are he and Jane getting where they're getting by saying, we'll keep quiet if?
Yeah.
Just give us a little bit more. Make me Earl of Warwick and I'll keep quiet. How does he suddenly become an earl in the aftermath of Henry VIII's death while there's a minority crisis? Because what's the one thing you don't want during a minority crisis? You don't want a rival claimant emerging.
Oh, okay. All right.
There isn't really a rival claimant to Edward VI.
No, there's not.
Particularly around. Are they appeasing John Dudley by giving him this old family title of his mother's, putting him on the council, because he's saying, wouldn't it be a shame if a rival Yorkist claimant was to emerge right now and stake a claim to the throne of this little child?
I find this fascinating because I've always read it as he was given that earldom because they took the Lord High Admiral from him and gave it to Thomas Seymour. So to appease him, they gave him that earldom. But I've never thought of looking at it in a completely different way, that he could have said, okay, fine, I'll give it to him, but you guys better give what's rightfully mine back to me.
Yeah, yeah, I think he is definitely reaching into, he's reaching into his family tree and he's giving it a shake and he's seeing what's there that he can lay his hands on. And the earldom of Warwick is one that is definitely available. He can't have Shrewsbury because the Talbots are still around and they're not going to be very happy, if he tries to get that one from the depths of the family tree. But he can get Warwick, and it's clear that it's clear to me that John Dudley wants these things. He has a very clear idea of what it is that he wants. He sees the roadmap in front of him to providing some dynastic structure to his family and security for them if he was to fall. And that's not to say that he's, not ruthlessly ambitious for himself in all of this, but I think he's aware, because of what happened to him, that there are problems with playing the game. He wants to be playing three-dimensional chess because there are problems with just playing a normal game of chess that if you lose, you're out. And how much of what he's getting is, I might want the earldom of Warwick. I'd love to be Earl of Warwick. It'd be fantastic. How on earth am I going to get that?
Yeah.
What does John Dudley have that makes people think we will promote him through the, he's a Viscount. He's the levels of nobility start at Baron and go to Viscount. So he's kind of on only the second rung of the nobility. And he is then rocketed up to the rank of Earl, and not just Earl, but Earl of Warwick, which is one of the most significant titles in England. In medieval England, Earls of Warwick were quite often given precedence as the senior Earl in the kingdom. So he is being rocketed up through the nobility at this point. Why? Why him? Yes, the Seymours are getting dukedoms, get Duke of Somerset and all of that kind of stuff. So yes, there are promotions around to bolster these people who are going to be the council for the young Edward VI. And maybe it's just that. And maybe John has had his eye on the earldom of Warwick and knows he's timed it really well to stake his claim on it and to bolster his position as a member of Edward VI's government. Or maybe he's blackmailing people and he's like, Jane and I will keep quiet if I get this, and if I get this, and if I get this.
Yeah. And, Edward Seymour wanted nothing more than to be Lord Protector. And so he was willing to wheel and deal to get what he needed from these guys, too. And I wonder if he even realized what he was getting himself into by giving this earldom to John, or if John just bamboozled him into it.
Yeah, I mean, John is clearly not above browbeating people, bullying people, blackmailing people. It's clearly part of his makeup. So it could just be that he's very good at doing those things, at striking at the right moment, and at saying to Seymour, what you really need is an earl to support you. If I was an earl, I'd definitely support you.
Yes,
Is it just that? It could be nothing more than that.
Yeah.
But I just find some of those theories and those things so interesting. Why is Jane Dudley a princess?
Yeah.
Why is Jane Guildford a princess? Why is John Dudley writing to Thomas Cromwell to get him to take care of John Clement? Some of these things are just odd coincidences that, I don't know, probably need investigating more, because something is going on in these spots. Whether they're connected or not, I don't know. But who is John Clement and how does he get to where he is? Who is Jane Guildford? And how does she get to the point where she's insisting that her son has to be King of England?
You have seriously blown my mind today, telling me about all of this. It has given me a whole new perspective, I think, on John Dudley. Now I have to go back to my research. I'm never going to finish this book.
Sorry.
But I love looking at all these different takes on history, because it just depends really on the documents that you look at and the research that you do, and then you determine what the story is. And in this case, I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out no, I'm just kidding. But I can't.
It's all subjective, isn't it? And for me, so definitely, I'm sure people listening will think this is bizarre conspiracy theory stuff. But for me, part of the point of history is just to ask these questions. Yeah. You can't tell me who John Clement is because we don't know enough about him. You can't tell me why Jane Dudley is called a princess on her tomb in Moore's Chapel at Chelsea Church in Tudor England. How is she getting herself called a princess?
Yeah.
And the point of history for me is to ask questions of these kinds of things, even if they're wrong. You know, is Jane Dudley connected to the princes in the Tower? I'm going to say probably not, but it's really interesting to think about how that connection might explain some of the things that are otherwise really difficult to explain.
Yeah. Oh, Matt, I love when you come on and we talk about stuff like this. You know, your theories on the Princes of the Tower anyway are fascinating. And then we throw all of this into it. The John Clement part, I wasn't expecting that today. I don't think you told me anything about that beforehand. So that was a surprise.
I like to ambush you with my balminess. She won't let me on if I say I'm going to talk about 15 balmy things today.
I definitely
I'm sure you
would.
want an audience left at the end of this.
I'm so intrigued. I want you to go down this path. I want you to do more research into John Clement and find out more about him, because there are so many questions now that even I have about who is this guy and why was he treated so special for somebody who shouldn't have been, maybe.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And there are entries at Louvain University for a nobleman, an English nobleman named John Clement. The entries at Louvain University span 70 years. Is that one John Clement, or is that a son of John Clement who is also called John? I don't know. But you know, there is so much stuff that I would love to know about John Clement. And I'm not saying he's one of the princes in the Tower. I'm not saying he's definitely connected to them. I'm saying I find this theory really interesting. This is Da Vinci Code stuff. You know, Google the painting and look at it, and look at Jack Leslaw's work. It is Da Vinci Code stuff way before the Da Vinci Code was a thing. And there is something about John Clement that I would love to be able to explain. Even if it's not connected to the princes in the Tower, I want to know who he is and how he got there.
Yeah, I agree. I am right there with you. I'll put a link to that painting in the show notes too, so you guys can easily access that. And I think I'm also over on Spotify. I'm going to do a poll and see what you guys think of who these two guys are. Were they really?
Should Matthew be locked up in a straitjacket? Yes or no?
That'll just be that
question. Assume a yes.
Matt, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing this amazing topic.
It's been a pleasure.